So, Mark, you were brought up in a minister's home and surrounded, if I remember your dad's library, by good books. But when did you first? What was the first banner book that you actually ever read?
First banner book I read was R.B. Kuipers' Evangelism, or God-Centred Evangelism. It was a book that I read when I was 15. I'd been a professing Christian for about 10 years, and just at a stage of life when I was beginning to wonder about what was involved in sharing the gospel with those around me. And was surrounded by a lot of people who had quite an Arminian approach to sharing the gospel. And I was hearing that for one quarter. I'd heard something very different from the preaching I'd grown up under. And I began to read about it, and Kuipers' book was the one that I turned to.
And you were still at school, obviously, when
still
that
happened.
Still at
school,
yeah. Were there any others in the school who read books like that? Or
no, there was most of my peers were fairly suspicious of that kind of theology, and it created something of a crisis for me, because I was surrounded by people who were eager to share their faith, but didn't really stop to think about what lay behind it.
Yeah. Is there anything you remember in particular that struck you or helped you about Kuipers' book?
I think the fact that I expected it to be a kind of hindrance to sharing the gospel, that if God predestines people to salvation, and there's nothing that we can do to choose it for ourselves, then what's the point of trying to persuade people? Yeah. But the more I read about his exposition of God's sovereignty over the task and his love that underpinned the call to share the gospel, it just opened up a whole new world in terms of knowing that this wasn't a futile thing to speak to people who were hostile to God and themselves. Yeah.